Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for HydroApps, Strong Guards, Strong Systems. My name is Kate, and I'm going to be taking us through the topics today that we'll talk through the idea behind getting your staff up and running so that they understand the operational impact of their role. And because of that, our session today is really designed for aquatic professionals to be able to take this information and bring it back to their team, but also for those frontline team members. So if you are listening to this recording or if you're joining us live and you are a frontline staff person, you're a lifeguard, a head guard, a manager, a coordinator, whatever your role might be, this session is really to help you understand the impact of your role and how it ties back to risk management. And if you're an aquatics professional, then I hope there's some content in here that you either can take and tweak for your team, or you're able to give them parts of this PowerPoint or this recording and be able to help them really see the angle that we're going for here. As always, we're really open to different feedback for webinar topics. So when we send out this recording and we send you the PowerPoint, we really welcome any input that you have of how this could be more applicable for your team and how this could be more landing for their level of understanding and knowledge, and how it helps you be able to explain the risk management side of things and the use of a tool like HydroApps and how that all integrates. So make sure you do give us that feedback so we can continue to refine these topics for you and kind of see if we're hitting the mark with trying to offer something for your part-time team or your seasonal team specifically. I know we all can get burnt out ourselves of executing and running that training. So this is kind of our stab at trying to provide an additional layer of training for your team on the risk management side that also blends in the work that they do within the software. So to get started, let's talk about what we're going to talk about. We are going to go through the following training objectives. We're going to talk about the role of how systems work in the context of the work that we do at the pool and at the waterfront or at the water park in aquatic safety. We're going to talk about inconsistency and what that looks like on a day-to-day level, a shift-to-shift level, but how that can increase conflict and also increase risk, and how behaviors can be tracked back to the different things that we can do as lifeguards, as managers, middle-level managers, and be able to make sure that we're being as consistent as possible with enforcement and with the execution and the follow-up of different tasks and behaviors to decrease the chance of risk and conflict. We're also going to talk about the connection between tasks and on-deck safety and where we see those things start to interact with each other and what that can look like. And then we'll also talk about, of course, because this is the HydroApps session, we'll talk about documentation and how that is helpful for the facility, obviously the organization at that level, but how it also helps protect staff and create steps in the process that refine and help you all be able to make sure that things are being completed so that there is 360 protection for patrons, staff, and then also the facility or the organization. So we have a few learning objectives. I'd like to kind of just lay out what we're going to talk through. We're going to talk about consistency as it relates to swim testing and safety decision-making practices. So we'll talk a little bit about the philosophy behind how we make decisions and how standard operating practices can help empower us and our lifeguard teams to be better decision makers. We'll talk about checklists and logs and how using these effectively can create, again, that muscle of consistency and behavioral change, essentially. So we know that one of the hardest parts of operating an aquatics facility is that we are working with people, both patrons and staff. And so getting everyone to act, how we want them to and in accordance with the safest, most consistent risk management behaviors can be a challenge. So we'll talk through that. We'll talk about recognizing and correcting gaps. So it is completely normal and appropriate to find that there are cracks and gaps and deficits in your daily safety systems. This is especially going to be true if you are newer to your facility, if your facility is new in and of itself and you're learning the ropes of things, you're learning the facility and the patrons that are going to attend the facility and how they're going to actually recreate in the facility. So it is normal to find those. But when you do, making sure that you can can A, find them, but then B, learn from them and adjust them is really crucial. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about accountability, everyone's favorite kind of buzzword. How do we get these habits to be scalable across our team, and how do we make them, again, that keyword, consistent and also enforceable at times so we can be consistent. So here's what I hope you take away. Practices around the swim tests, making sure that we're effectively logging information, having that gap, that critical eye for that gap detection, and then also how to have that accountability component and those feedback loops during shifts. So just a little bit about me. I am a team member here at HydroApps, but I also have different experience in the industry. Many of you have already heard this little spiel, but I started as a lifeguard, lots of experience on the deck in different settings at the collegiate level, the municipal level, open water with water, or not water camps, but day camps, overnight camps. And most of my professional experience was at a municipal entity where I was able to really kind of build the muscles around leadership and staff development. And I also did some consulting and training on the side with my side business, Aquatics, which led me to eventually join the HydroApps team and be able to be in charge of our thought leadership and our customer engagement, our strategic partnerships, all kind of the fun stuff, being able to teach about topics like risk management, operational excellence, while also attending conferences and being able to network with the industry in that way. I'm also part of the volunteer board for ILSERA, and I like to always just mention this because it's a great resource that not everyone yet knows exists. But ILSERA is a nonprofit organization that provides free peer-to-peer support when any lifeguards are in a critical response or a critical incident when they are on the job. So it's a really great thing just to have in your back pocket if you do have any instances over the summer season, whether it's a really large scale critical incident or if it's something that's on the smaller end but might be impacting staff in a way that's productive to their own mental or workplace well-being. It's a great resource. It's free. We have lots of different collateral that we put out. We also have some paid classes that help with mental health first aid and resilience and de-escalation, but the actual peer-to-peer support is completely free. So I like to make sure people know that nonprofit exists. Okay, let's jump in. So let's talk first about swim tests and why these are so crucial. So aquatic supervisors know that safety is related to the swim test, and it's not just a routine thing that we do, but it's really a decision of, is this person able to handle the risk of deeper water or more complex water if they're going down slides or it's moving water, maybe in a lazy river or a wave pool, or a deeper part of a zone in an open waterfront or in a pool. But for lifeguards, we want to really be thinking about the fact that we are trained to be doing the swim test, and that should be part of our orientation, is that we talk through how we execute swim tests, but we really want to also be connecting it to the concept that swim testing is a risk assessment. Every time that we are having someone go through the motions of a swim test, it's not just a routine that we do, but it really is designed to be something that helps us impact future decisions that we need to make, because it takes out the variable that this person might not be efficient at being able to be in different types of water, whether it's deeper water or it's higher risk water, based on their skill level. The idea of a swim test should be that it puts some pressure on the person who's taking it to be slightly under stress, so that way we can try to predict any future or added stress to the situation. And added stress could look like just the excitement of being in or around moving water or a feature of some kind. The added stress could be the weather implications, that it's getting more hot throughout the day, more sunny throughout the day, and then obviously fatigue as well. So as they have spent more time in our facility, their body will be under pressure as they maybe have been spending most of the winter indoors and not actively moving around a pool and getting kind of fatigued through the motions. So the decision of a swim test really also affects lifeguards for future scanning and future water vigilance. And so it's important that we're thinking about it that way as well. And we're setting ourselves up as best as possible to decide what the future state of their ability to be safe in a different setting looks like. So it's essentially a stress test. A lot of times we move away from thinking about this as a safety decision and we think about it more in the pressure we feel in the moment to fail someone or pass someone or maybe even retest someone. So it's really important that we think about this more from a risk management perspective and that we also think about the question of what is likely to happen later. So if it's difficult now, it'll only increase in theoretical difficulty. So it's important that we're thinking about this really holistically. When we are really evaluating staff, what we're looking at isn't just can they do the test, right? Can they have the metrics that we're looking for as far as their body position, some type of regulated breathing and rhythmic breathing of some kind, the ability to recover and not panic or be overwhelmed in the water. But we're actually making sure that they are able to be under stress in addition to being able to perform these other metrics here on the left. And the benefit of having systemized approaches towards this is that it helps with groupthink, where all of us on the team, when we're giving the test, we're going to be thinking in the future, have we gone through this lens of what it'll look like when we add more complexity to the situation, and we're all operating from that same place. The good idea behind also the consistency here is we can help reevaluate when it's appropriate for us to retest and fail and pass. And there is much more support behind this idea of not one person being the bad guy or one person maybe being stricter than everybody else, but it helps make sure that everyone will look at the same situation with a shared sense of unity behind the decision that they're going to make. So it helps make the decision more uniform and it helps make the decision more widely acceptable and then as a result consistent. So it's important that we think about kind of anybody that's on that line of maybe passing, should not be passing. And if it's a hardcore, not going to pass, then retesting also really isn't something that probably is the most appropriate. We tend to use retesting as this like dangling carrot where it feels better to say to, especially to an adult or a guardian, but they can retest later. And oftentimes we might be setting them up for another person, another lifeguard to later have to make that decision on the barely pass line of things. So just be mindful of if you're using that kind of to soften the blow a little bit instead of really being a lot more arbitrary about this. And I guess for those of you that are in the live version of this, that you're listening, I'd love to hear in the chat if you feel like your staff would be taking a consistent approach if they all were seeing the same swim test being conducted. I know the aim is yes, hopefully they would, but I'd be curious to know if you think across your team, if they would be on the same page about a situation where someone's taking a test and maybe there's some red flags that they're not going to pass. Would they all be in alignment? Would they allow a retest or would they all say that they didn't pass for that day? So we always want to be thinking about the downstream effect as it relates to our work as lifeguards and frontline supervisors. So thinking about questions like, what are your decisions ultimately affecting? Being able to know as a fellow lifeguard that the person who is conducting swim tests is being consistent and being very able to look at things from a black and white perspective gives them confidence that what they're seeing in the water when they're in those areas that people need to have the wristband or need to have the marking that they've passed to be in that more risky water or deeper water is really helpful, because when they start to see something that maybe seems outside of the lines of what's appropriate behavior or response or confidence in that swimmer, they know that the work has already been done to make sure that that person's a safe swimmer in that setting based on that swim test. And then that allows them to respond appropriately and not second guess themselves with their response. It also helps with the recognition in distress. So we know that if someone's in that area, they've passed the test, we've held them to this standard. So if they're struggling even a little bit, then they're not on the line of being able to pass or fail, right? They definitely were exhibiting safe behaviors during the swim test and with that stress of the swim test, which is why we have have them do more than just generally swim, right? We have them tread water, we have them do rhythmic breathing, we add in elements, floating, treading, turning around, orienting themselves to the exit. All of these things are designed to help put some extra stress and situational awareness on the person. It also helps the patron know that if they are clearing the test, then they have that ability to be able to use whatever that feature is or that attraction is, or be in that area, and that has a impact on patron behavior. And then it of course also has a impact on the likeliness of needing to intervene in some capacity. So it's important that we just remember at the frontline level that inconsistent decision making can follow and does follow swimmers into the water, and then it also follows us from the deck into our actual zone. So it's a really good kind of thought process to have of how could this later come up and be a future issue in my zone, or as I'm in the stairs, or as I'm in my chair, not in the stairs. Hopefully no one's guarding from stairs, but who knows? There could be a slide, a bottom of a slide where there's stairs that they're standing near. Okay, so let's talk about how inconsistency creates conflict. So when I was a guard in college, I worked at a water park, and one of my favorite and least favorite, so it was kind of this like pro and con spot in the rotation, was the top of one of the slides that we had. It was a big bowl slide, and it was a you had to take the swim test to take it, and you had to be a certain height as well per slide manufacturer guidelines. It was the best because it was a time where, you know, we just had to tell people to cross their arms and legs, not sit up, and give them the thumbs up when it was time to go down. But it was really stressful because this would be where some operational inconsistency would show up, because people didn't want to tell people that had, you know, gone 250 stairs up to the top of the tower that their kid wasn't tall enough, that they weren't tall enough. And so oftentimes when we would get up there were kids that would say, I've been going down this slide all day. What do you mean I can't go down? And a parent would be like, yeah, they've been going down all day. It's your issue that you guys aren't being consistent. So this definitely happens, and it creates conflict, right? Because then we figure out, because the patron tells us who let them do it all day, and they have descriptions, and it creates this kind of conflict and this back and forth a little bit. And no one wants to be the bad guy. It's really hard to constantly be the one that's the only one enforcing things. So just thinking about this as it relates to conflict, we have the ability to help with pushback from guardians, of making sure that people aren't just already saying, you know, they passed yesterday. Sometimes people will say that even when it's not true. So be mindful of that, but it often does happen this way too. And even day camp counselors too, there can be some inconsistency. It's hard to take things away from people. So it's just something to keep in mind, that you do want to be confident before you give someone something, but we also need to be more comfy with the idea of taking things away when it becomes a liability or a risk as well. And sometimes that might mean access to a feature or deep water, or the ability to like have a wristband for that day because they're no longer executing safe behavior. And that might mean that there does need to be conversations with our manager or with our supervisor to be able to retrain another peer or staff person on how to do this effectively. But that's a much easier problem to solve than having something escalate to an instance where we need to then intervene, which is our last line of defense, is being able to intervene, right? We have all these other risk management processes in place, so that way there's layers of protection of people at our location. And so the last layer is that we as guards jump in and intervene when they need our assistance. Sometimes we can't prevent that if they have a medical emergency of some kind, but sometimes we can by making sure that we're following the other processes. It can create staff tension, like I mentioned. We definitely had staff tension at times at my water park. And this idea of the guard said, you know, it was okay for today, or they were tall enough and they were able to kind of squeak by. So when it's on the line, it's really important that we're just as consistent as possible. And hopefully that's something that your supervisors are also training you on. So what do you do when someone's just at the line? We had to do a lot of work around our verbiage for how old you had to be to come into our facility. There's a difference between over the age of 12 and 12 and over. So just being really clear and concise with what you're meaning with all these things is key. And then also just the fact of undermined authority. So it can be really difficult to manage this as a young person where you feel like you're doing the right thing and you're being consistent and not really understanding some of that nuance between each of the situations. So just having this be something that comes up in conversation and that you're talking through as a team and that you're also able to bring up to your supervisor is great. So as much as possible, we want to try to standardize decisions. And if you've been a part of any training that I've done before, you know that I do a lot of training on inclusion and a lot of training on equity and diversity. And a lot of times I talk about the need for gray things and gray areas. But there are lots of topics where having a standardized approach is the best for consistency because we're talking about a shared understanding. And as much as possible, we need to work through what shared understandings look like so people aren't having to make decisions in the moment. Because when we start to make our staff make too many decisions, they do get decision fatigue. And the biggest, most important decision we want them to be making on a daily basis when they're in their rotation and they're being vigilant of water and of the deck is if they need to interfere with dangerous behavior or problematic behavior that's leading them towards needing to do a rescue of some kind and that recognition eye. So if we start to really use a lot of mental power and mental space towards them having to make decisions that are maybe those few steps before that kind of last layer of defense, we might be taking away their efficacy at those future levels. So as much as possible, we want to have clear and shared criteria. We want to try to have the same expectations across all staff. And we do want to get into the granular questions of, well, what if they're just on the line for the measurement? And what happened? Are we measuring hair or are we having a measurement of a stick that we, push down into their hair? We want to make sure that as much as possible, they're not having to use their gut feelings and, gut reactions to make decisions that can be standardized because we want to leave room for them to be able to do that also where it really is counting more beyond these just initial steps. It's obviously a good thing to have staff be flexing their discernment, right? Discernment's so important for our staff to develop and for us to develop as people and workers and, citizens of the world. So it's still an important skill to have, but we can have our staff work on discernment in other contexts instead of these ones with decision making. So good systems remove guesswork and everyone is making the same call the same way every time. As much as possible, we want to just try to solve the equation for this. And if we're finding as frontline leaders that there's maybe some inconsistency in some of this, then our task is to bring that to our manager, bring that to our supervisor, and have some conversations about how we can make the process more standardized. So documentation is always the backup. You hear a lot of times if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. We just want to make some consistency around how we do everything. So standardizing our swim test process and the process to how we log that information so we can go back through, have that accountability, reduce any disputes, and then make sure that all of that documentation supports and bolsters whatever response we need when it comes to incidents as well. One of the fun things you can do is just have questions about how we can be talking through this together. So I asked earlier, do you feel like your staff would all agree about a pass, fail, or a retest if they encountered the same situation? This is a great thing to work on in training, your orientations as well. But asking a question of an 8-year-old completes a swim across the pool. Their body's mostly vertical. They have to stop temporarily to grab a landline or a wall, and then they finish the entirety of the test, but they look tired. I think most of us would say that's a situation where we would fail the swim test participant and we wouldn't retest, right? Their look of visible tiredness is going to signal to us that they're not ready to retest, and that added elements of fatigue and weather and all those types of things are going to only continue to add. But the question is, would your team have that same approach? We want to be thinking about this again as a safety decision and being consistent, and then using documentation to help you be able to log that information and make sure that that criteria is consistent. Okay, so this concept that I'm kind of talking through as we go is that every daily task is a safety behavior. And I think that this has always been the realm or the frame of mind that I've come at with HydroApps. I know HydroApps can be a tool of alignment for a lot of people that are more on the maintenance side, but I've always been more excited by the staff management side. And I think when we look at everything as a small task that's forming the structure of your safety system, I think that kind of starts to make the checklist and the inspections and all the reports and the forms and the maintenance tickets. I think that makes all of that stuff more exciting. And if we're not someone that's really in that lane of maintenance where we get excited about more of the maintenance or the operational pump room stuff, that can help us kind of see the excitement behind this. And sometimes it's just reframing ourselves as how is facility management really a tool towards risk management and part of that safety system. So here, we want to be thinking about not only how much we're providing of documentation, but also that we're doing it consistently and accurately. So making sure that when things are recognized that they need to be filled out, and when we're in charge of walking around the deck or walking around the facility and checking everything, that we're actually doing that and going for an actual routine movement and behavior of walking around and looking at different things and assessing different things. Oftentimes we can get kind of pulled into other things that feel like they're more urgent. And so when it's time to fill out the inspection or the checklist, we're kind of standing in the office, maybe filling some stuff out and being like, nope, I think the letters look good today. They definitely looked okay yesterday when I actually went out and looked. But as much as possible, we want to move ourselves physically into the position of walking around and actually doing those inspections like we're supposed to. One of my favorite concepts is managing by walking around. So this idea that you walk around, you see what's going on, and you notice things. You notice hair in the drain. You notice a rotation that maybe you wouldn't have necessarily seen if you were on the other side of the deck. You notice there's some trash under the bleachers. You notice there's a chipped tile in the deep end. You notice that there's something at the bottom of the pool, like a diving ring from lessons. So this is also a great way to walk around and not just notice things that are going on a facility level, but also just auditing staff's behavior if you're a manager or a coordinator. And then also, this is a great way to coach staff. So have them walk around with you when these things are going on. If you're someone that checks on how well staff is completing pool tests and checklists and inspections, occasionally walking around with them after they've done one is a really great way to have a learning tool as well. I find that no one had as keen of an eye as me of doing a facility check until we really broke it down and walked around together and were able to identify all those little things. I could make a joke here about this also being the case at home with my son too, with walking around and asking, did you pick up all your stuff in the living room type of thing. So same type of idea. We're building that muscle, we're flexing that skill all the time, but it's definitely something to keep in mind and another layer that you can be thinking about. Tying all of this back to not only compliance, but also to your culture is a great way to make this behavior and these topics actually stick and have traction. So there's a lot of things that are compliance based organically in aquatics. There's things that we have to do because the state says we have to do them. There's things that we have to do because our organization requires them of us, and the inspectors that come and fill out reports for us require us to do. Just like with our certification agencies, there's things we have to do to stay compliant. And so this can lead us towards this mentality of focusing on checking the box and being reactive when things come up. And we've talked a little bit about making sure that not only when things are identified that we are making a plan for them, but we're also making sure that we follow through with that stuff. So it's not enough just to identify issues, but we really have to follow through with rectifying what we find as well. And because of this, our staff can often have minimal ownership over this because we just feel like we have to do it and we don't always understand why we have to do it, how it ties back to us. And this means that also we have to do a ton of oversight around this, because if staff doesn't really understand why they're doing it, it's not super tied to their purpose or tied to your culture. So as much as possible, we want to think about how we maintain the compliance piece, but we also shift into this idea that everything that we do also has a tie back to our culture, and it's a tool of prevention and protection as much for our staff as it is for our patrons and our guests that come to our facilities. So it's really the difference between thinking about prevention, protection, and being proactive on the culture side. And it's a shared responsibility that all of us have together. So the maintenance staff, the lifeguards, the programmers, the swim instructors, we all have this shared safety mentality that we work together. And every task that we ask everyone to do comes back to some type of reason, and it's not just an arbitrary thing. And this also helps a lot with peer-to-peer accountability, which we know from on-the-job training. The most impactful on-the-job training that your staff do is learning from other people at your workplace about the norms and expectations of your roles. So what that means is that even if you do an orientation with all the new lifeguards and show them how to take the pool test, even if they do that to the standard, when they come to their second and third and fourth and fifth shift and they see that the most senior lifeguard on that shift just does all three tests at the end of the shift, that is going to be what they're learning from workplace education. So it's just important that that's built into the culture so that way we can make sure that we're preventing things like that and that we're also having that level of accountability. I love kind of looking at risk management from this idea of frequency versus severity. So a lot of times we think of kind of these big things and the frequency is likely to happen and then the severity is high and then what is the risk level based on that. So it's just important that we know that we're never going to eliminate any potential for something to go wrong at our facility. We know some of our most likely instances are we're going to have emergencies based on health outcomes that people have that are completely out of our control and that the person has no idea is about to happen either. And so we can't ever eliminate all risk completely, but we can focus on things that in this table have a high risk when they do happen and have a high outcome when they do happen. So talking with your supervisors and supervisors talking with lifeguards about what's going to happen can really help us think about all of these small tasks and how they come together to create kind of bigger issues. They also can make explanation happen of when something's happening a lot of the time and what that means for our operations. What's really nice about using something like HydroApps is also that you're going to be able to pull your own data and be able to have conversations around these. So if you are able to pull information about slips and falls, that's going to help you put some actual information to what you're seeing on the deck and be able to use prevention and use training to help inform that. So this is a great activity that you can do with lifeguards as part of training and kind of talk through this and talk about the difference between the likelihood that it could happen, the severity if it does happen, and then how we're able to prioritize that through small tasks. So one of the biggest things that happens is we don't do tasks that we're supposed to do as part of filling out forms or logging our pool test or logging our swim test. So it's important just to really tie this back to what the real consequence is. So there is a consequence beyond just not filling out a pool test. There is a consequence beyond not filling out a checklist completely before you open for the day. And the takeaway is that every time we don't do something, we're weakening the system that's designed to keep our patrons safe and us safe as well. And we don't always see that these small little yellow flags or little red flags can add up. And so it takes lots of different eyes on different items for it to then become a bigger issue, which is why it's so important that frontline staff are doing their role to check these things off and that they're trained well to know what they're looking at, because the next few levels of supervisors are really expecting that to happen so that they can prevent things like injuries or a systematic failure or an unnecessary closure or a maintenance closure of some kind because we skipped chemical checks or we didn't check the crash bags like we're supposed to at every opening shift, or we didn't check that the AED pads were in the kit and things like that. So we don't want to wait until we have an actual consequence. That's why we have all these processes and all these small steps in place. And sometimes it can feel like it's not that urgent. And so it's important that we really connect these misses to those real consequences. It's just human nature that some people are going to skip different components in a system. And it's generally not that they don't care. It's just that we have other priorities that are pulling us in different directions. So we might be really busy. We might be in a rush. We're going to follow what other people are doing. So again, if the culture is that we don't all do this, and that's going to make it less likely that we have that follow through. No one wants to be the one that is upholding the authority only. Can feel really uncomfortable, especially for new and younger staff. So being mindful of that's important. It's also natural for people to be either overwhelmed or overloaded, or the opposite can be true, where we get a false sense of confidence that we're good and we'll notice these things that happen, and we don't need to necessarily fill out the information or take the information down. But that's why we have systems, because systems are designed to help the entire organization make sure that there's enough redundancy also in the process, that if something happens outside of the normal, or if someone's taking a shortcut that's preventing them from being able to fully take the step that they're supposed to in the safety system, that there's other mechanisms in there. But if we always are skipping things or taking shortcuts because we assume that everyone else is going to do it, then we break down the system essentially. So it's really important that we remember how critical we are to that process and to that system. So habits are really fun and interesting, and it's something that I hope more and more aquatic professionals will talk about with their teams. But as much as possible, we want to make behaviors simple and automatic. So we want to reduce decision fatigue as much as possible. Routines help us do that. So when we wake up in the morning, this is why Steve Jobs always wore like a black, was it turtleneck? He wanted to create this creativity where his brain didn't need to think about every single day, what am I going to wear? But instead, he wanted to save his mental capacity for making more important decisions. So we wore the same thing every single day to reduce that decision fatigue, which I think is a really fun example. Hopefully, I got it right. And I'm pretty sure it's a black turtleneck. I also think of the uh, Elizabeth Holmes. She also wore a black turtleneck, but I think they both did. It also helps build muscle memory and consistency, and it follows a routine of cues into a routine into a reward. So when, as humans, we stack together these ideas of cues, so a prompt of some kind, and then it's part of the routine, and then we have this reward cycle. So it's really also, from a human level, it's really pleasing for us to be doing habit stacking and to be going through these automatic processes. There's so many great ideas of how you can tie safety behaviors to different actions. So when your staff clock in, they complete the opening checklist. When they finish the rotation, they walk through the locker room, or they go check the first aid kit, or they go refill water bottles. At the hour mark, everybody, gets up and does a part of the deep or deck, excuse me, safety sweep, and just kind of walks through and makes sure everything is looking how it's supposed to. And obviously, you're also tracking some of these things, right? Like equipment checks, track that. Opening checklist, track that. Anytime you're doing a facility walkthrough, you want to try to track that. So all of these things are really mindful. If you're someone who struggles with the follow through of this, also just thinking about what your own cues and routine and reward are going to be. So for some people, the cue might be I clock in, I do the opening checklist, and then I go and I fill up my my water bottle with ice from the vending or the ice machine in concessions that has the really good bubble ice that I love, right? That's like the part of the structure: cues, routine, and reward. Is it called bubble ice? Pebble ice, not bubble ice, pebble ice. Clearly, I don't get it very often, but it's the good ice for sure. So let's talk a little bit about the risk connection. So tasks don't always, these tasks don't always feel like lifeguarding necessarily, right? So these are also the other duties as assigned, but it's really important that we know that anything, like I already said, that happens eventually can show up in our zone if we don't keep track of it and we don't address it. So eventually not taking the pool test might lead to unbalanced water. Unbalanced water can eventually not be clear. We can't see the bottom of the pool. That becomes an issue for lifeguarding. So it's really important that we tie all of this back so we have real reason behind what we're doing. This is just another further example of behind the scenes, water chemistry. We talked about closures, which impacts obviously our schedule and our ability to make money, risk to illness, visibility issues. If we can't see the drains, we can't be open. It becomes just more and more of an issue. On inventory and equipment, broken equipment, having gaps in our readiness when we do respond, of not having all the things that maybe we need. And then obviously different things related to scanning breakdowns and overcrowding as it relates to tracking capacity and things like that. The big takeaway that I'm hoping that we're starting to land with is that consistency equals protection. So, being able to prevent those conflicts really is helpful, and that inconsistency of, patron conflict, any tension, legal liability, all of that stuff starts to be minimized. It won't be completely reduced or um, gone down to zero, but it is minimized, which I think is really important. Small gaps can have those big consequences. So, like we talked about, there's that cause and effect. So, missing the equipment can worsen the outcome of someone that you have to provide care to if you haven't done the work of checking the first aid kit and things like that. As much as possible, when you're a frontline person, you really want to think about what the reason is behind all of the things that you're doing. And if there's something you don't know why you're doing something in a specific way or a specific manner, your supervisor should be really open to hearing that conversation with you and explaining it to you. Hopefully, the explanation makes sense, but if it doesn't, dig a little deeper and just ask the question of, can you explain why we have this? And then if it's difficult for the supervisor to find kind of some of the reasoning behind it, then that's a great opportunity to talk through how can we make this essential, or how can we reduce this if it's not necessary. Having unnecessary small tasks also will erode people's likeliness to perform the task, because it'll seem more performative than preventative, and then that will be something that eventually people will start to kind of trim those corners and take those mental shortcuts or those physical shortcuts through the, like, filling out the checklist from the office. Consistency isn't about just being strict, right? It's about being reliable and making sure that we understand that if systems are varying, then safety is varying too. So systems are really designed to create that consistency that we favor. Inconsistency in real life can be like the swim test example. It also can be reinforcement around rules, someone being more relaxed or kind of more likely not to call something out. Inconsistency with paperwork, and then any decisions related that are relying on judgment instead of those standards, again, is an opportunity for consistency. And this is why there's different behavioral standards at times. So we want to make sure that we're being as consistent as possible. If we're a head guard and we're enforcing behavior, we want to be as consistent as possible as well, and not give extra space for people to kind of make decisions or to behave outside of the standard just because they're friends of ours, or because we maybe take a liking to them in some kind. We want to try to be as seamless as possible with these shared standards. We've talked a little bit about what it looks like when patrons there's conflict and there's pushback, but it's also important to remember that we get the side of staff as well feeling frustrated or second guessing their own judgment. And when staff starts to second guess their own judgment, that can be really difficult, because it can it can make them feel like it can undermine their own ability to trust their own judgment, because they all attended the same orientation as everybody else where it said, this is how we do things. And so then they start to kind of second guess things, and that can affect their confidence as well. And that can obviously have issues with credibility and authority, and it can increase liability and risk exposure. So it's really important that we're thinking about these things internally, but then we're also making sure that as inconsistency is showing up externally, that we're also addressing it. The big thing that I like to point out is that when you have a shared system, you have a shared truth. So you have the same rules, the same documentation, and the same outcome, and people are aligned with what that framework looks like, and it takes out that guessing. It can be really difficult to get to a point where you're having that shared system and shared truth, but if you make it clear that that's the aim, then that can be really helpful, and hopefully you're backed up by the additional middle managers and your supervisors, so it feels like this is something that you can really step into. So documentation, to kind of wrap things up. So documentation protects the person, and it protects the organization. It obviously protects staff, and it protects guests in our location, and it confirms what was done. It supports decision-making that's made in different incidents, and it helps make visibility across the system or across the agency be clear. So it's really about being able to prove what happened, when it happened, and how it was handled, and how that relates back to the system as well. Operational visibility is this idea that staff can and the public can see the way that we're operating things, and they have access to also be able to understand decisions that are made and consistency. Obviously, they can't be privy to every single thing that's happening, but as much as possible, when they're involved in the frontline version of this, we want them to make sure that our team is able to see what's going on and that they have that buy-in. When documentation is missing, so when things are happening, there isn't record of different checks that are taking, we miss timelines, there isn't a way to really verify who's doing what and what's that based on, and we don't have record of things like swim tests that help us tell a story. So it's important that we know that it can be difficult to prove what we've done and why we've done it, and then that can be difficult to defend as well. So we just want to be thinking about as incidents occur, and if there isn't any way of tracking that, then that opens the ability for us to have questions around why people are making certain calls and making certain decisions and certain judgments. As much as possible, when it comes to documentation, you want to be doing it in real time. You want to be as clear and specific as you can be. You want to stay consistent. So as much as possible, you don't want to be varying between staff, and you want to close the loop. So closing the loop has to do with making sure that everything is done to completion and that we also address anything that's been identified in the follow-up process, and we've addressed that as well. So strong systems move through this formula of prevent, document, and protect. So we really want to be thinking about the actions and the steps and the behaviors, kind of the links of prevention, and then how we document that we're doing that, and then how that in effect is protecting safety in a predictable way. So prevent, document, and protect. And this is the framework behind this idea of strong guards and strong systems creates that predictable safety. So hopefully by now you have a few ideas as a frontline leader about ways that you can be using your processes to support yourself. If you are the most senior person that's listening to this, just be thinking about how you can help your frontline leaders and your frontline staff move through standardized systems like safety decisions and swim tests, how you can be tracking and completing those smaller tasks on a daily level that become the yellow flags or the red flags to different failures or process failures, how you can be logging things consistently across staff and as much as possible making that a uniform process so that there's as little need as possible for people to be making decisions on non-critical processes, and then creating visibility for people who are not always on deck, but are the ones that are making those implementation decisions. So how are they able to see what's going on and making sure that things are getting done as well? And then how do you turn your daily tasks into measurable safety systems and items? Okay, I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions. If you have a question and you're live, feel free to pop that into the chat and I will address that. If you're listening to the recording and a question has come up, I just progressed to the last slide here that has my email address and welcome you to reach out and email me if you have any questions about the content that we talked about, any of the sources, or how you can be matching some of this information into your HydroApps use. Okay, and it looks like we don't have any questions coming up, which is totally fine. If anything does come up, I invite you to send me an email at kateconnell@hydroapps.com. And those of you that are attending live, it is May 15th, so I know we are in the thick of it, and I wish you a really safe start to your summer season. If our team can support you in any way through the use of HydroApps or just in general related to questions, please reach out. We will send the recording of this session to you all, and we welcome any additional questions or feedback from you as we go.